Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me and thank you for being here. My name is Tawedian, former research assistant at INTERGRAF. And today I want to talk to you about a project I conducted with INTERGRAF for a period of around 5 months during this year, titled Comparing Print and Digital Media with a focus on sustainability, efficiency, and perceptions. So this project resulted to a database as well as a report, which you can see on the screen, which aimed to review all different kinds of studies which compare all forms of printed and digital communication tools in terms of sustainability, efficiency, so how good they are at what they're trying to do, but also consumer perceptions. And in this report, you can find the main trends, key messages, and limitations, which I will go over during this presentation briefly. There are 4 topics which I will get to. I will not be able to discuss everything that is in the report, but you are free to ask me questions after the presentation. So just some statistics about the project itself. So as I said, there's around 80 studies, 78 studies to be exact, which I reviewed, compared and analyzed critically. I made sure that most of these research projects are recent. So most research projects, as you can see on the screen, were written between 2019 and 2024. And most of these articles were also peer-reviewed. Most of them are academic articles or reports that were reviewed by external parties. So there are 4 topics that are covered in the report. The first one is reading, and I will focus today on education. The second is the digital divide and inequalities when it comes to digital skills in Europe. Third is marketing and the efficiency of digital versus print marketing. And fourth is sustainability, to what extent one type of communication tool is more sustainable than the other. But let's start with reading. Reading is a very interesting body of research, and today I will focus on education. In the report, there's also some discussions around leisure reading with adults, which has been discussed briefly today. But today I want to talk about education, and I want to start with the results of the PISA study. The PISA study is a study that's conducted by the OECD, which compares the academic abilities of 15-year-olds in terms of reading comprehension, mathematics, and science. Here on the screen, I have the reading comprehension scores of the last around 20 years for both the OECD average and Latvia. We can see that they follow both a similar trend. Around 2012-2014, we see that there's a rather steep decline in reading comprehension scores. Latvian scores also follow the same trend, even though they are slightly lower than the OECD average. And specifically between 2018 and 2022 for the OECD average, we see that there is a decline of more than 10 points of reading comprehension scores, which is equivalent to half a year of learning. Now, why that is, there are several factors that go into it. But one of the main drivers, let's say, of this negative trend in reading comprehension scores is that education is changing. It's going through a transition phase, which can be quite awkward for children to follow, and that is its digitalization. And I want to talk about the shallowing hypothesis, which explains all of this. So what does the shallowing hypothesis say? It is the principles that were declared in the Stavanger Declaration, which were already discussed today, but just to give a brief overview. What the shallowing hypothesis says is that reading on screen is synonymous with superficial reading behaviors. So regardless of which text I'm reading, when I'm on a screen, I tend to skip paragraphs, try to look for one specific sentence that I'm looking for, and it's harder for me to read the text from A to Z with a good level of concentration. And this is what this Stavanger Declaration says. It is a meta-analysis of more than 54 studies that comprise over 170,000 participants. And it says that the comprehension of long-form informational text is stronger when reading on paper than on screens. And more recently as well, there have been newer studies in the field of neuroscience, which also back this message. Now, I do want to give some nuance that digital tools aren't all bad, is that there is some nuance to this conversation. Digital tools can be an interesting way to drive student engagement in what the teacher is trying to teach. So here I cite a UNESCO meta-analysis of 43 studies on digital game-based application, and the meta-analysis concludes that increased motivation to learn and increases collaboration skills. Also, similar thing can be said about parent-teacher interactions. Digital tools can be an interesting platform to facilitate these types of exchanges. What the problem is not necessarily digital enough itself, it's the intensive technology use. It's the fact that we want to replace all sorts of printed product into digital ones, which can be problematic and which can lead to the problems I cited earlier. Now, besides comprehension, there are other, let's say, ethical challenges or difficulties that come with the digitalization of education, which were cited in the UNESCO report I cited on screen here. First one is obviously safety and well-being. To have children being exposed to the internet at a very early age is quite challenging, and there needs to be a way to make sure safety and well-being is guaranteed for these children. Secondly is evaluation. Technology, digital technologies, by very nature of the industry, changes extremely rapidly. For example, my mother is a teacher, and she tells me that every year they get a new platform to work with. So what that means is that it makes it difficult to evaluate as researcher. If everything changes all the time constantly, it's hard to evaluate the effectiveness of something. So, thirdly, privacy and data tracking. I cite the UNESCO report here. 89% of educational technology products recommended during the COVID-19 pandemic could follow users outside of school hours. And the user here are small children. So that is another problem. And finally, the digital divide. More than 5.3% of children in Europe are digitally deprived. 5.3 might not seem like a big number, but it's still consequential to think of. To think that there are 5% of children in Europe that don't have access to the internet or don't have the necessary skills to access the internet. And that is not just a problem with children, it's a problem in Europe as a whole, that there is a digital divide. There is a digital divide in terms of access to digital products or the internet, in terms of skills, the necessary skills that are required to efficiently use these digital tools, and also there are differences in choice, which I want to get to. More than 44% of Europeans do not have basic digital skills. And my source here is the European Commission. This is Eurostat data. Also, on top of that, there are great inequalities between different regions in Europe. So, for example, if we go more towards the Balkans, southeastern Europe, that's 20% of individuals that only have basic digital skills. In northwestern Europe, in northern and northwestern Europe, more than 50% of the population have above basic digital skills. And these inequalities aren't just regional, they are also across different age demographics or different demographic factors. So here, for example, I gave the example of the inequalities between different age groups. This graph shows the results for Latvia, but I noticed that this trend is similar across all European countries, and the European average has a similar trend as well. So if you can see the two blue columns, these represent 16 to 34-year-olds. 35% of this population do not have basic digital skills. This number increases with the age bracket. So, for example, 45 to 54-year-olds, 57% of this demographic don't have basic digital skills. And when it comes to the older demographics, such as 65 to 74-year-olds, it goes up to 86%. Another source of inequality is different levels of formal education. Here I have the results for both Latvia and the European average, Latvia being in blue, the EU being in red. For the EU, we see that the higher the level of education, the higher the level of digital skills. So for the lowest level of education, we have 35% of individuals that have at least basic digital skills, and for the highest, 84%. I found the Latvian scores interesting because we see there's not much difference between the low and the medium level of formal education, where it's at around 32–33%. And for higher education, for people in higher education, that's 65%, which is around 20 points less than the European average. Now, it's not just about skills, but it's also about choice. Quite simply, there are some people that prefer printed products over over digital ones, especially when it comes to security or things that contain more sensitive information. Here I cite the Two Sides Trend Tracker of 2023, which says that 76% of Europeans want to be able to choose between paper and digital billing. 56% of EU citizens are concerned about cyber attacks and cyber crimes, which make them perhaps more likely to want keeping hard copies instead of digital ones, which the Two Sides report of 2018 says 73% of European consumers believe that keeping hard copies is a more secure way of storing information. Now I want to talk about marketing, and marketing, print marketing within a digital landscape, let's say. We're always talking about how marketing has become digitalized. We're in this digital marketing era, and there's a reason for it, is that it does provide something sort of novel in the sense that social media allows brands to create a sort of customer involvement, to have very direct one-to-one interactions with consumers and to create a community around that, which can create a seamless experience for consumers. And that does have its advantages for brands, obviously. That being said, there are ethical considerations to take note of. That could be from the brand side when it comes to intrusive advertising, unethical practices when it comes to data collection, but also user misbehavior. While the internet democratizes speech, which is in theory a good thing, it also makes room for fake news, for spreading misinformation on a brand's page, so on and so forth. And another point to take note of is targeting vulnerable groups, such as the children, for example, which I cited here, but also the elderly, who might not have the right, let's say, skills or background to analyze properly an online advertisement, and this might incite brands to be more intrusive, to create more intrusive advertising for these groups. Now, what is print's advantage when it comes to digital? Attention, quite simply. Here I cite a report by JIC Mail, which talks about what we call a lock-in power. Basically, the story is online advertising. When you're dealing with online advertising, you're exposed to millions of messages at the same time. So when you're looking at an ad, you're getting notifications from one place, you're getting an ad within an ad for another brand. You're constantly overstimulated and you're constantly exposed to different types of marketing messages. Whereas with print, there's not this issue of competing for screen time, let's say, that someone who's advertising on a screen would. This creates, according to the report, an economic efficiency when you compare the costs of advertising compared to the time unit of attention. So here I put a graph of index cost per time unit of attention. Social display and desktop display are the more expensive per time unit of attention compared to direct mail or door drops, for example. An important message to follow, which is one of the key messages of this report, is that we're not trying here to say that one thing is better to the other, is to create synergies between printed products and digital products. So for example, in marketing, there are different trends that show that. Here I cite QR codes, for example, which are printed material, but that creates a sort of synergy between printed marketing material that can be found, these QR codes can be found on brochures or posters, for example, and the digital side of the marketing mix for these brands. Also, I cite a study here which says that direct mail has a direct and indirect impact on consumer purchase behavior and synergy with display advertising, and that print and digital tools can fulfill different functions in the marketing mix. Lastly, I want to talk about sustainability. Here I cite the Two Sides report on the Two Sides Trend Tracker report of 2023 again. It says that 56% of European consumers believe e-communications are more environmentally friendly than paper communication. Do I have an answer to what does the science say? Unfortunately, not really. When I was working at INTERGRAF, I was really trying to understand the methodology behind comparing these two very different industries. And I got to learn more about LCAs, life cycle assessments. And what a life cycle assessment does, it is compare one product with another from raw materials to the disposal of a product. And in this case, we're dealing with two rather different industries when it comes to production. Very different production processes, different materials, different sources of carbon footprint emission. So what this creates is that there is a big gap in the literature. There's a very widespread of data in the literature on this topic. So here in the bottom text box, I cite a report that talks about energy consumption reduction. It's a meta-analysis which compares different studies, that have studied printed and digital products. And the quote, and I quote, "The literature identifies impact ranging from 90% reduction in life cycle consumption to 2,000% increases in energy consumption." So you see there's quite a big spread in the data. And what this paper says is that what influences this is the changes in key assumptions. When you are a scientist, you cannot study everything, especially when you're dealing with a study which tries to compare apples to oranges. So you have to make a lot of assumptions. You can make assumptions on the unit itself, so the product itself, which stages of the life cycle to include in the analysis, the reliability of the data. So are you using a national average? Are you contacting companies to get the data itself? Are you making estimates by just an estimated guess? What type of technology and processes were used in the production of these products? And also the consumer behavior, which might influence the results. These types of studies, LCAs, they look at the environment from a very micro perspective. So we're comparing one type of product to another. But it doesn't really go into the macro side of things. How does digital as a whole impact our environment is not necessarily discussed. It's just delimited to one product. So here I do want to give some data about that, is that digital is not neutral when it comes to the environment. Digital technologies account for between 8 to 10% of our energy consumption and 2 to 4% of our greenhouse gas emissions. That's data from the European Commission itself from this year. Greenhouse gas emissions of on-demand videos, so Netflix and co, are equivalent to the same levels as the country of Chile. That's a report from Shift Project in 2019. And also when it comes to waste, e-waste is the fastest growing solid waste stream in worldwide and in Europe, 3 to 5% in Europe. And here I have for the European data, I compare, while they're different things, I would agree, but still it's interesting to see the comparison in data. The difference between paper voluntary recycling and e-waste voluntary recycling. Recycling rate in EU 27 for paper in 2021 was 73%, which is very close to the target recycling rate of 76% for 2030. Whereas for e-waste, voluntary recycling, the recycling rate is at 46%, and the European Commission's target rate is at 65%. So there is quite a gap. Now, I talked about a lot of various different topics, a lot of different studies, but the main remarks I want to conclude with are the following. First of all, statistics are produced, they're not a given, so it's very important to understand the methodology behind its creation. How did researchers come up with these numbers? What does that mean, etc. So the importance of methodology as research design, it's extremely important to understand that in order to give context to a set of data. Secondly, communication is not one thing, it's many things. As was said earlier, a book is not a book is not a book, so it depends what you're trying. So these communication tools fulfill different functions and they have different advantages and disadvantages. And what we need to focus on is not substituting digital to print or print to digital, but to analyze its complementarity, the complementarity of communication tools. And lastly, I want to note that whatever we do, it's also important to take note of the protection of vulnerable groups, that being children, the elderly, the poor, etc. And these things do have an impact over perpetuating inequalities across different variables. So I just put the references for the presentation here, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.